So thank you everybody for being here. My name is Omid, and I'm here to tell you how everything beautiful is in Plug. What is meant by that title is that there is much to be gained from reading the Plug library, and a lot of what we consider to be best practices in programming, or things to try to do more often or less often or what have you, are in this very important library that we have in the Elixir language. But a little bit about me first. I'm a developer at Mojo Tech, a consulting group in Providence, Rhode Island. I'm the father of two and a co-organizer of a new conference called Elixir with Love Conference, which basically stole from this conference the idea that you can take a conference and add a great experience to it and make it special. A little bit about Mojo Tech. We work in all kinds of tech stacks. We're hiring. I'm glad to plug them more if you want to approach me after. But let me give you the high-level outline of the important parts of this talk. And my interest in best practices and programming philosophies really informed why I'm giving this talk. And one of those philosophies is that we should read code in order to become better programmers. A lot of times, especially for people who are beginning, and I didn't begin very long ago myself, we think that writing great code and coming up with great solutions and being very clever is the purpose. However, there's a lot of growing we can do by reading the code of others who have been doing it for longer and who oftentimes can show us better ways of thinking and different ways of thinking. And so that very much informed why I set down the path that I did to research Plug a little bit. But it's also an important part of why I'm doing this talk. Secondly, a more practical reason why I'm doing this talk is because we shouldn't meta-program. And that might seem random, but meta-programming makes a lot of things harder, which I'll go into in one of my slides. But one of the reasons we should is when it really beautifies our code and simplifies and makes things more elegant and more natural, which is very rare. But because it's in Plug Router, I felt it was very special to talk about it. So the specific reasons why we should avoid meta-programming are probably familiar to some of us, but definitely if you've tried to find a bug in code that relies heavily on meta-programming, it's hard because there's no Git blame to be doled out for, for bugs that were caused by meta-programming. Your code wrote the bad code, and that's causing the bug, and so that can make things harder to solve. But also, it's awkward to name and to do basic maintainability practices, and therefore harder to contribute to heavily meta-programmed code. And most of the time, functions can just handle the work that we're supposed to do. So those are all reasons why we should be prejudiced against using meta-programming, even though, as it so happens in Elixir, it's made a lot simpler and more accessible. It's still not the best thing to do because it's hard. And that's a really good reason not to do something, especially if you've got beginners on your team, or if you're interested in onboarding new people, or if you have just the desire to have readable, expressive code. It makes things more difficult, except, like I said at the beginning, when you can get a vast gain in simplicity or reduction in lines of code because of it. Another reason to use meta-programming is that you're designing a DSL or a dev interface that where you don't know the names of all the functions or the names of all the things that your end user might want to put into their program. Are there other reasons why we should meta-program or could? And just to give you a bit of a late introduction, if you were at Elixir Days, which is another conference that we had this year, or have watched the videos of my previous talks, I like to involve the audience. And so, since so many of you didn't know that, you eagerly sat toward the front of the room, not knowing what would be awaiting you. So can I have first a show of hands for anyone who can think of other reasons we should meta-program, or shouldn't, either way? Go ahead.
Elixir does it for method overloading on the upcasing of ASCII. So basically it reads like an ASCII table or a Unicode table in, and then defines function heads for that. So it's really performant.
So the gentleman said that there's a very performant solution to upcasing?
Yeah.
Of ASCII characters?
Or Unicode characters.
Unicode characters.
Where it defines the function base of it.
Okay. Very interesting. Other contributions, good metaprogramming use cases. Gentleman in the tie. Or bad, or if you're not wearing a tie, actually, it's just your lanyard. No, I'm talking to you, man. You can turn around. You. Yeah, your lanyard looks beautifully like a tie. Reasons to or not to metaprogram?
I think we're doing like a lot of like binary extractions and just like conversions.
Binary extractions or conversions?
Especially like when you have like block binary format and you have some like outside format, you have to write a lot of code to do the extraction. And you just like plug using a macro.
Excellent. Other ideas, and maybe against the idea of metaprogramming. Any hands? Well, yes, you were spared earlier, but now you're going.
Say, yeah, don't do that, Brian. You don't know how to do it. You just want to do it in school.
Excellent, and that's a very good one. Don't do it. Oh yes, of course. He said that don't do it because it's cool, or merely because it's cool. You could do it because it's cool plus other things, but especially if you don't know how to do it well, it's best to avoid it. Very good. Other thoughts, to or not to? Yes, sir. With the glasses, go ahead.
Having your more experienced people solve the harder problems by writing DSLs to delegate the simpler work to the more junior.
Excellent. So a good use case, if I understand you correctly, is to have people who do have the experience and familiarity with writing macros and metaprogramming to do the DSL work and letting others either use that or consume it as the target audience. Very good. So there are reasons, and there's a lot of debate and a lot of thought about when and how. And I think that in the book Metaprogramming in Elixir by Chris McCord, we get that nice Fight Club-like mantra of like the first thing to know about metaprogramming is that you do not do metaprogramming. So there's that general debate. But one other situation in which I think we can justify metaprogramming, and this may be because it creates structures and flows of logic that are beautiful and elegant. That may be one of the cases where it could be a little bit harder to explain or justify in the real world when you're on the job. Excuse me, boss, I'm going to go ahead and introduce this macro because it's beautiful. You know, that's not exactly the explanation you would give during a stand-up or during planning or when writing documentation. But it just so happens that while not the exclusive reason why I'm sure it's used in plug router, is true about plug router. So as I said at the beginning, if you're not already familiar, plug is a part of the Elixir language, and it's a specification for composable modules between web applications, and that's just another way of saying that you can stack them up in different orders and put together functional flows of the connection through your logic. And focusing specifically on plug router, the router is what it sounds like. And if you come from Ruby like I do, plug router gives you a very familiar DSL to what you might find in Sinatra, where you just specify your gets, your posts, and your what have yous, and an incoming request will be matched to that action accordingly or to that route accordingly. And that's how simple it is to use. And so one big argument for using metaprogramming here is that there's this DSL that is extremely simple because of the macros that were written in it. But to go one layer deeper inside plug router, you'll find this. The using macro does something really simple. And I'm not going to talk about dispatch. I'm going to focus on match. And what match does is it calls do match, which is one of our common practices for drilling down and preparing ourselves for some pattern matching. And so do match is doing something there, but who defines do match? And that's something that is interesting. We're using a macro, we're defining match to in that macro, but it internally calls do match. But how do we get that function? It's defined when you specify a route, but you have to course through a few bits of logic to get there. So the route, by writing the route, we define it through this different course of logic. suppose you write that get for, the root. It has to go through the compile for function to properly unpack the metaprogramming that happens from writing the route. So already we're seeing sort of two roads that are beginning to converge. One is when you put in your use plug router, which went ahead and it called do match. And from the other end, you're defining your route, which internally is defining that do match through the compile function. And what's beautiful is that your code is using code that called code you didn't code, right? There's metaprogramming and metaprogramming that you do sort of write or specify or declare in your application, but it's those two things that have actual functions that really talk to each other. And that's one of the things that makes it very beautiful. And to riff off of Eugenia's nice talk, there's a braid being created there, if you will, of intertangled metaprogramming that you put into place to get the end result of that very elegant DSL. So to recap, we use plug router on one hand, and we add plug match on the other. And we use plug router and add plug match to use that match function, and it expects do match to be defined. And on the other hand, we specify the route that defines that do match. And so the beauty of it is that it allows for that simple DSL through that two-pronged approach to having macros talk to each other. And that's what I think makes it beautiful. And so among the reasons to metaprogram or not to metaprogram, I feel like this is one that is worth studying and which I very much enjoyed reading myself. So I encourage you to do the same. But that's it. Thank you so much for listening.